Some more terminology here regarding equities, well, other securities as well. When we talk about a long position, we're talking about a position in the market where you gain when the asset values increase and have losses when the asset values decrease, of course. So purchasing stock would say you have a long position in an equities share. Okay? When it comes to derivatives, specifically puts or calls. Okay? Now, a call gives you the right to buy a security at a particular price, at a specific price. So when you own a call option, you do gain when the underlying asset, the underlying shares that you've got a call option on, increase in price. So we'd say you have a long position and you are long the calls. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because in the case of puts, you have the right to sell, say, some shares of stock at a specific price. So if you buy those puts, you have a long, you're long the puts. We would say that. But versus the asset, you have a short position because these puts gain in value when the asset price falls. So there's where people get confused here. So if we're talking about a position or exposure in the market, it has to do with the asset price. If we're talking about a specific security and we say, well, you're long calls, that means you own calls, and that is a long position relative to the asset, a long exposure. With puts, if you're long the puts, because you purchase puts, you actually have a short exposure to the asset. You'll gain when the price falls and lose when the price increases. And the other side of that is just a short position. So gains when the asset values decrease. So if we sell short an equity security, some shares of stock, we gain when the share price falls. If we write calls or sell calls, then we have a short position versus the asset or a short exposure. And as noted, purchasing puts, you're long the puts, you bought the puts, but your exposure in the market is a short position versus the price of the asset. When we talk about financial leverage, we're just talking about borrowing part of the purchase price or posting margin that's less than the asset value of the futures contract. So if you buy a building with 10% down, you have 5% leverage. You've borrowed 90% of the purchase price. So same idea in the securities markets. So let's talk about selling short and how that works. An investor borrows the stock. So you've got to talk to your broker and find out, can you borrow the stock? Yes, you can borrow the stock. Okay, I want to sell it at the current price. The idea is to repurchase the stock in the future, return it. You've got to cover your loan of the stock, so you've got to return the stock to the lender. And that's called covering your short position. And of course, the idea is to, instead of buying low and selling high later, is to sell high now and buy it back at a lower price at a future date. So the short seller's profit is the original selling price minus the repurchase price. Now there's some adjustments we'll consider in there, some interest on the margin loan, commissions on the sale, and payment of dividends. Because as we get down here to the rules of short selling, the short sellers pay all the dividends to the lender. So if I borrow stock, actually the brokerage house will have some accounts where the stock can be loaned, and they don't have to tell the owner of the stock because they have the right to loan it. But the owner of the stock still owns it. It's just been lent out. So that's why the short seller must pay the dividends. So the lender of the stock is still going to get their dividends on the stock. And the short seller must deposit margin or collateral. You can't just call your broker and say, yeah, I'd like to sell short, 1,000 shares of Amazon. Could you do that and send me the money? No, they're not going to send you money. They're going to keep the money from the short sale on deposit. But also they're going to require a margin deposit from the short seller. And that margin deposit is there, so if the price moves against you and you have losses, it's going to come out of that margin deposit. They don't have to call you up or chase you around or anything. And of course, you don't need a credit check either because you've deposited your margin in either cash or securities. So let's talk about buying on margin, taking a long position on margin. You're just borrowing a portion of the purchase price of the stock. And in this case, the broker is going to hold on to the stock as collateral, but also require an initial margin, a minimum equity percentage at the time of purchase. And so these are just determined by the securities regulators and other financial authorities. And it's often 50% that you have to put up. That's your minimum equity or initial margin requirement. But it can be higher than that. Okay? If your account's concentrated in one security, they may, rather than a diversified portfolio, they may require a higher percentage. If it's a low-priced or especially volatile stock, they might require a greater initial margin requirement to protect themselves and ensure the repayment of the loan. Okay. So the maintenance margin, if the stock price moves down after you invest on margin, then your equity percentage is falling. Well, at some point, to protect their interests and also to comply with financial regulations, they're going to say, okay, if you get below this margin, you need to put more money into the account, or else we need to close it out, either way. And so your equity percentage at any point in time is the stock value, the stock price in the market, minus the loan value divided by the stock value. So it's the percentage you own after we take out the percentage that is backing the loan. So let's look at some numbers on this and some of the mechanics of it. Assume initially an investor buys 1,000 shares of stock with a 40% margin requirement at a price of $100 per share. The margin loan rate is 40%. That's an annual rate there. The stock pays an annual dividend of $2 a share. There's a commission on the purchase of 5 cents a share and also on the sale. At the end of 1 year, let's assume that investor sells the stock at $110 a share, and let's just trace through what the gains and losses are, taking account of all these factors here. And what we want to calculate is the return on the margin position. So if you put up, for example, 50% on buying an asset and borrow the rest, then your gains and losses on your invested amount, we say leverage 2 to 1 there. So if the stock goes up 1%, or the asset goes up 1% in value, you earn 2% on your invested amount because you invested half of the purchase price. So that's the idea of the leverage involved here on the margin position. So let's take a look. Here's how you can figure that leverage ratio. In this case, we have a 40% initial margin requirement, so we're borrowing 60%. Well, if we divide 1 by that 0.4, that 40% initial margin requirement, we get a leverage ratio of 2.5. So if we ignored all this other stuff, all these other costs, a 10% increase in the stock would increase your equity investment by 2.5 times that, by 25%. So on our example, our initial investment for 1,000 shares at $100 a share, 40% of that is $40,000. So that's going to be what we need to deposit in the account, plus we need to pay the commissions. Well, that's 1,000 shares. We assumed the commissions were 5 cents a share. So that's $50 in commission. So your initial deposit into the account, the margin account for this position, is $40,050. So that's your cash that you've put into it. So when you calculate this leveraged return or return on a margin transaction, You can think of it as a cash-on-cash return. So this is the initial cash. Now let's figure how much cash we get at the end of the year, and we'll be able to figure out our leveraged return or our cash-on-cash return. So the dividends paid, we had 1,000 shares, and dividends are paid during the year $2 a share. So that's $2,000. So that's an inflow into the account. The interest on the loan, well, we borrowed $60,000 of the $100,000 purchase price. So 4% of that is $2,400. So that's going to be a flow out of the account to pay the interest for the 1-year holding period. The sale proceeds, well, we assumed at the end of the year we were selling the stock for $110 a share, so that's $110,000 inflow into the account. Shares are gone, $110,000 is in the account. We have to pay the commission on the sale, so that's an outflow of $50. So our net proceeds are the $110,000 sale price, plus the dividends we received, minus we had to repay the loan and the interest on the loan, and we had to pay the sales commission. So here's what we have at the end, $49,550. So let's compare that to our initial cash investment. So we ended up with $49,550. We invested $40,050. So that ratio minus 1 is our holding period return, our 1-year holding period return, and that's 23.72%. Well, remember our leverage factor. We know the price of this stock went up 10%, right? 10% from $100 a share to $110 a share. We said our leverage ratio was 2.5. Remember, that was our 1 over our cash requirement, our initial margin requirement of 40%. That's supposed to be 0.40, so I'll make that point big there. And so that would be 25%. Well, we had the dividends, we had the interest on the loan, we had the commissions that changed that a little, but you can see we're pretty close to that, even after those adjustments at 23.72%. Now, you're required by the curriculum, learning outcome statement requires that you know at what price will you get a margin call. Okay. So if we invested with a particular initial margin requirement and a given maintenance margin requirement, we might want to know, well, how far could this stock fall before the brokerage house is going to give me a margin call and say either send in more money or we're going to close out your position and send you whatever equity value is left in the position. So the formula here is price P0. This is the price at the time you bought the stock. Here's our initial margin requirement. This was 40%, right, in our previous example. And then we need to know, well, what's the maintenance margin? How far could my equity percentage fall in the account before I'm required to put in more money? Well, let's put some numbers to this to calculating the price below which we'll get a margin call. So assume this investor buys stock on margin. The price per share is $40. The initial margin requirement is 50%, and the maintenance margin requirement is 25%. So we need to calculate this trigger price, the price below which the investor will get a margin call. Well, here's the formula. Right here, we've got 1 minus the initial margin over 1 minus the maintenance margin, and times the price, the purchase price of the stock. And so we can solve that easily enough and come up with 2667. Now, if you're having trouble remembering this formula, it might be easier to think about the fact, let's say P star is this trigger price. Okay? And we work this on a per share basis. It doesn't matter how many shares you buy, the trigger prices for a margin call is going to be the same. So we know at that price that the equity in the account equals 25% of this trigger price. So the only trick is to remember that the loan must be 75% because this price is changing, but the loan per share stays the same. So we can rewrite this, okay, and say, well, the loan per share is 75% of this trigger price. And then we can just solve for that trigger price, and what do we get? We get loan divided by 75 equals this trigger price. So now we can do that. Now look back at the formula. Our numerator here, 1 minus the initial margin requirement, our loan per share is what? It's $20. Well, $20 is that times our $40 per share. So our loan per share initially was $20. And what's in the denominator here? 0.75. That's just 1 minus this maintenance margin requirement. Put 0.75 there, and we get our trigger price for a margin call of $26.67.